The Lucifer principle. I think this is lesson 8 or 9. I can't quite remember. I have to look it up. But it'll be on the title. The Lucifer principle, a scientific expedition into the forces of history. Part 4, one man's God is another man's devil. This is actually more about the power of ideas. There's 3 ways to get people to do things. And basically, this is going to explore probably all 3. But the basic way to get people, the 3 ways to get people to do things is by force, which is by the sword, the spear, the knife, the gun. Any ways you force them to do things, whether they want to or not, with physical force. The second way is to buy them. You offer them jobs, you offer them a better lifestyle, you offer them a better way to make a living. Let's buy them with wealth. And the third way is persuasion. You give them an idealistic mean to get them out of the condition that they're in. This is basically what we're going to explore right here in One Man's God is Another Man's Devil. Okay, 3 sections: us versus them, the value of having an enemy, the perpetual trick that manufactures devils, how hatred builds the walls of society, of society's bungalow. It's about politics right now, okay? So first, we're going to dive into us versus them. Nature uses only the strongest threads to weave her patterns. So each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry. And that's Richard Feynman. White blood cells in the immune system function as soldiers on patrol. They are constantly scouring the corridors of the body, prowling for intruders as they move through the veins and capillaries. They encounter billions of friendly cells and a myriad of scrapes of flotsam and jetsam that belong to the body itself. Should they make a mistake and attack these compatriots, the body would be in severe trouble. It's called an autoimmune disease for folks that don't know. How does the immune system manage to avoid cases of a mistaken identity? The cells of the body have the equivalent of a uniform, a chemical combination as unique as a human face or a fingerprint. What's more, invading viruses also have distinctive chemical costume. When a white blood cell detects the markings of the virus, it goes on the attack and sends out signals summoning its legion of confederates to the assault. Uniforms are as necessary to the cellular level, on the cellular level. They are also proved indispensable to human society. Very true. That's why you have markings, uniforms, ways that one tribe can recognize another, or recognize each other. Margaret Mead says every human group makes a simple rule: thou shalt not kill members of our gang, but everyone else is fair game. According to Mead, each group says that all humans are brothers and declares that murdering humans is out of the question. But most groups have a very strange means of defining who is human. Just like in war, first thing you have to do is dehumanize the other group. Radical Muslims, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, gooks, krauts, Japs. In other words, it goes on and on and on and on and on. You have to dehumanize the other group. A tribal member is, in most primitive societies, is a full-fledged human being. A citizen of some other tribe, on the other hand, is usually not. Primitive tribes, says Mead, feel that if you run across one of those subhumans from a rival group in the forest, the most appropriate thing to do is bludgeon him to death. In America, I don't have to tell you how close that is to the truth, right? We've been dealing with that for 400 years, right? Like white blood cells, no one said use white in this instance, passing each other in the body's corridors but destroying foreign intruders, Humans of the same tribe recognize each other as parts of the same flesh and avoid hostilities. The second, white people don't go to jail in the numbers that black people do. A body is a collective of cells that have to get along to survive. A society is a collective of individuals that have to do the same. Humans range from the most primitive to the most sophisticated, form cozy in groups that assault outsiders, clumping together as competitive superorganisms. This tendency, as we've already seen, is not limited to human beings. Lewis Thomas has pointed out that even lethargic-looking sea anemones engage in cold wars. Two seemingly identical patches of anemones on a rock may appear to live in peaceful harmony. In reality, however, the colonies edge against each other, aggressively trying to dislodge a rival community from the rock they both call home. Like white blood cells and the denizens of the primitive tribe, the members of each anemonal clump knows who's one of us and who is one of them. According to Harvard's E.O. Wilson, xenophobia, the fear and hatred of interlopers, we're dealing with that right now with Hispanics, is a universal in higher animals. Wilson explains that squabbling within a group is minor compared to the snarling, spitting, and rankings of claws that occur when group members encounter an outsider. Much of the animal communication observed by ethologists, in fact, seems to have evolved to help one animal tell his killer companions, "Hey, I'm one of us." For example, calls allow one bird to tell others he's part of their flock. Some bird societies have even evolved to their own dialects to aid in this purpose. Animal markings and specialized scents also help bees tell who is part of their own pack and who is not. Humans, too, need a way of identifying who they're supposed to take care of and who they're supposed to oppose. Some of those identifiers include how you hold your fork, what language you speak, what kind of clothes you wear, how close you stand to someone, how you say hello, what haircut you choose, and what color you paint your face. It's called culture, folks. Leaders fashioning new social organisms seem to instinctively recognize the fact that they will have to find ways to brand their own converts as different from everyone else. Moses coined a slogan, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." He enjoined his followers to inscribe the sentence in their doorposts, where they would see it every time they went out and came in, and to tie scraps of parchment marked with the phrase to their arms every morning and every night, to make sure that Jews would be marked as separate from members of any group. He even gave them a distinctive diet. By the way, Hitler also did the same thing, marking Jews during their pogrom when he was during their Holocaust. He marked them with numbers. He actually counted them, and he actually made them sew on a Star of David onto their clothing so that everybody else would recognize them. So history does repeat itself. Lenin was born in a supremely middle-class family, but he dressed in the unmistakable clothing of a worker, adopted workers' slang, and encouraged his followers to do the same. Then he pointed to an enemy with a radically different style of couture and speech, the well-coiffed bourgeoisie. Muhammad gave his followers a set of prayers and ritual washings to execute 5 times a day. Then he instructed the faithful to signal their identity with whiskers on their chins, shunning the razor and glorifying the growth of beards. See, it wasn't just a practice. The practice is to bind people together. And then the identifying markers that you wanted the group. That's where profiling comes in. Now, gangbangers started wearing those hip hop clothes and with basically the sagging pants and the tats and all that stuff well before it got into the rest of the culture. And then ordinary folks dressed in that way wondered how come you get identified as gang members, or still today are recognized as gang members. You take up gang culture, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be instructed that you're one of us. Same thing with colors and the way you speak with Crips and Bloods. It's very, very common. This is very, very powerful. Each leader gave his followers a set of markings to identify them as one of us. And he set up the signals that would would make spotting the unbeliever easy as pie. Gang, can we say gang signs, folks? The quick identification of us and them is necessary because the competition between superorganisms, whether they're cultures or subcultures, can get very serious indeed. The Israelites Moses had gathered would soon be battling Canaanites. In those campaigns, the Hebrews could easily be wiped out. Muhammad's followers were about to take on the superpowers of the entire Western world. To the informed handicapper, the odds of Muslim survival would have seemed astonishingly slim. Lenin's converts would soon kill the Tsar, his wife and children, and exile the aristocrats who had tyrannized Russia for centuries, and wipe out the entrepreneurs and successful farmers who had fueled the economy's rapid economic expansion. Meanwhile, in 1917, counter-revolutionaries would mount a bloody civil war against the Marxists. Had they been able to, these adherents of the old order would have presided over the Bolsheviks' extermination. The battle between social groups is no mere parlor pantomime. Being mistaken for a member of the wrong team can be fatal. The battles between groups in a society at peace may be far less bloody, but they are no less persistent. Welfare families want to raise their payments. Middle-class folks would like to avoid upping the taxes that provide the welfare checks. Landlords want to raise rents. Tenant groups want to lower them. Rockers want to start a club on the corner. Older couples in the neighborhood want to protect their peace and quiet. Conservatives want to seize more power. Liberals want to render them powerless. Men want to avoid housework. Women want them to do more cleaning and mopping. All are clashes between clusters of humans who feel you're either with us or against us. They are battles for turf, like the slow struggles between competing clumps of anemones on a rock. I love Bloom I love Bloom because he brings this kind of stuff home and makes it our everyday life or our everyday experience kind of measurable and simplified in a sense. And he weaves all these things together because it's a human experience. The thing that's going on between black women and black men, same thing. That article that Damon Young did, it caused a divide line between how black men feel in their experience and black women feel in their experience. Those are two competing groups. Within the group of those who wear markings of the correct superorganism, all may be cozy and humane. But if your markings are wrong, watch out. Bertha Krupp, heiress of the German industrial family that armed Hitler's Third Reich, regularly visited Krupp factory workers who were ill. He generously comforted those in need. Bertha saw herself as a warm, compassionate, and giving. But she had no compunctions about the fact that her son ran slave camps in which people were beaten from the time they got up in the morning until the time they crawled into a lice-ridden bunk at night, deliberately underfed until they worked themselves to death. Bertha was not even concerned that her family maintained gas ovens on the factory grounds to eliminate those forced laborers who might prove recalcitrant. In her own eyes, Bertha Krupp was a good, charitable person. Her kindness extended to those she considered human. The Slavs and Jews from whose bones she ground her fortune, on the other hand, were of a distinctly different subspecies. Bertha and her Germans of the time referred to those subservient beings with one simple word, Stücke, Stück, or livestock. As Margaret Mead said, killing real people is forbidden, but folks beyond the boundaries of your own superorganism aren't really people, are they? The value of having an enemy. True to the principles enunciated by Margaret Mead, every culture handcuffs hostility within the group. But in exchange for this imprisonment of anger, the culture offers a set of outsiders it's acceptable to loathe and sometimes kill. Those are folks we call enemies. A charismatic leader's invocation of the enemy's image is frequently what draws the social organism together. Orval Faubus, governor of Arkansas from 1955 to 1967, knew how to pull together the social beast. He did it by creating an enemy that didn't exist. In 1957, Faubus was facing an uphill battle for re-election. His popularity was down. He had upset liberals by allowing utilities and railroads to raise their rates and had stepped on the toes of conservatives by increasing taxes. But Faubus had an ace up his sleeve, the creation of a boogeyman. 3 years earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled that schools must be integrated. The South was outraged. Numerous Southern politicians were trying to capitalize on the issue, but none knew how to turn it into a full-scale headline-grabbing drama with themselves at the center. None, that is, but Faubus. The governor's opening move was simple. He phoned the deputy attorney general in Washington to ask what the feds planned to do to head off violence when Little Rock schools opened their doors in September to both black and white kids. The attorney general's office was perplexed. As far as they could tell, Little Rock seemed remarkably peaceful. So the feds flew an official in to find out what the governor knew that they didn't. Faubus played it cagey. He had evidence that violence would indeed erupt, he said, but it was too vague and indefinite to turn over to anyone else. Violence, said the mayor of Little Rock in astonishment. There was no indication whatever of it. We had no reason to believe that there would be violence. Governor Faubus declared that the mayor was wrong. Little Rock stores, he said, were running out of knives, and most of those newly purchased blades were in the pockets of blacks. Here we go. The FBI checked on Faubus' claims. In 100 stores, the sale of guns and knives were actually down. Where have they played on the black boogeyman before? They've been doing that since 1790. But there were weapons being brandished openly in the streets. They belonged to the National Guard troops the governor had called in to defend the citizens of his fair state against the assaults of the supposedly well-armed enemy. When 9 black children showed up outside Central High ready to enroll on the first day of school, those guardsmen raised their rifles and turned the kids away. Again, the FBI checked for signs of the budding black insurrection. Faubus kept implying was about to begin. Clues to the existence of the horde threatening to slit the throats of innumerable innocent whites. This time, the authorities in Washington issued a 500-page report. They couldn't find a shred of evidence to prove Faubus right. Sounds a lot like Damon Young. The federal gumshoes should have checked the home of Orval Faubus' close friend Jimmy the Flash Caron. Karam was the Arkansas State Athletic Commissioner, a man who could whip together a squad of oversized brutes in a minute's notice. One day in mid-September, Faubus slipped away into a Southern Governors Conference in Sea Island, Georgia, leaving the Flash to carry out a delicate mission. Early in the pre-dawn hours outside of Central High, Carmen positioned a squad of thugs recruited from the local sports teams. When the first class bell rang at 8:45 a.m., 4 African-American reporters showed up to cover the black students' attempts to approach their high school. One of the Karam's heavies let out a cry, "Here come the niggers!" The black journalists beat a hasty retreat, but not hasty enough. "20 of the whites planted by the Flash cornered the reporters and started punching hard. As the police moved in, Carm wrote, or the niggers started it. Radio newscasts reported the melee, and soon the dregs of white Little Rock, spoiling to defend Caucasian honor, began to pour in. Hundreds of them. When they couldn't find enough blacks to beat, they turned on Northerners. They pounded the bejesus out of the 3 reporters from Life magazine. The violence that Orval Faubus had predicted for Little Rock had arrived. That old story, us versus them. Jimmy Karam darted to the gas station phone booth to fill the governor in on the situation. Faubus threw a press conference at the Sea Island Governors Convention and declared soberly that the trouble in Little Rock vindicates my good judgment. President Eisenhower was forced to send in the 327th Battle Group of the 101st Airborne Division to try and restore calm and enforce the Supreme Court desegregation order. What did I tell you about Eisenhower? Now Faubus had 2 enemies threatening his virtuous citizens, the murderous blacks and the Yankee government, the same government that had humiliated the South in the Civil War. Faubus strutted and preened and protested. He got national news times on ABC TV, lambasting the president for having stripped the South of its freedom. Sounds a lot like Donald Trump. He declared that the FBI had taken innocent Southern girls into custody, grilling them for hours, and condemned the federal soldiers for putting bayonets in the backs of schoolgirls. The warm red blood of patriotic Americans staining the cold, naked, unsheathed knives. He accused the soldiers of invading the girls' locker room to leer at the helpless women pinned there by brute force. Investigation showed that the events Faubus described so vividly had never occurred. But that scarcely mattered. In the minds of Arkansas citizens, only one man was standing up to these northern attacks: Governor Orval Faubus. The result was simple. Faubus had been in danger of losing the election. Instead, he outstripped his closest opponent by nearly 5-1. And Faubus won every election after that until he finally retired. By creating an enemy, Faubus had galvanized Arkansas behind him, turning a cloud of disorganized citizens into a social mass. Fidel Castro found the existence of enemies equally indispensable, but he had a stroke of luck Faubus lacked. His enemy actually existed. The foe Fidel used to achieve social cohesion. Look at that word. Remember that word. Social cohesion. It's in the literature right now. It's something that the World Economic Forum talks about as far as the wealth gap. It's social cohesion. It was the United States, the massive imperialist monster that over the years, he said, had stripped Cuba of her sovereignty. Fidel needed to distract his constituency from the mind-boggling string of broken campaign promises. In the days before Castro seized power, the bearded leader had stirred up popular support for his revolution by posing as a political moderate, a champion of democracy and of open society. The guise was a deception. Castro had been studying Lenin, Marx, and the Argentinian despot Juan Perón for years. His real goal was a dictatorship, a form of government that would put every last scrap of power in the hands of only one man. Got to remember about Bloom, just as an aside. Okay, Bloom is conservative, even though he talks liberal. That's number one. Number two, he is a Zionist. So there's going to be, everybody has a slant, and you got to recognize what the slant is. It doesn't mean that his information is not correct. Just his choices of information is going to be slanted. Even though I try to be pragmatic and down the middle, even I'm slanted sometimes to one way or the other. Everybody is. But the thing is, you have to look at the information first and then the slant second. Selling the idea of totalitarianism to the Cuban population, however, might have been a difficult proposition. Instead, Fidel played on the island's dream of freedom. While he was still fighting his guerrilla war in the mountains, Castro appointed as president of his provisional government a patriotic, well-meaning, pro-democratic judge from Santiago named Manuel Urrutia. Urrutia's presence gave Fidel's movement an unmistakable democratic flavor. Fidel went even further. In an interview with Look magazine and an article he penned for Cornet magazine, Castro declared passionately that his goal for Cuba was the liberty of his people, civil rights, free enterprise, and the privilege of electing officials. Capitalism did that back in the day too. If you listen to Richard Wolff, these statements were a sham. Now that he toppled Batista, how could a leader who had sold his followers on a freely elected government get away with imposing a despotic political system? Through the adroit use of an enemy. The technique was embodied in Castro's manipulation of an unsuspecting pawn, President Urrutia. When Fidel first came down from the mountains in triumph and took over the reins of authority, he filled his cabinet with figures of indisputably moderate credentials. Then he secretly established a shadow government. In this clandestine group were the real revolutionaries, committed Marxist-Leninists like himself, figures determined to implement a program of social justice. Look at that. That word keeps popping up. That would entail snatching land from peasants, establishing state-controlled collective farms, drafting the populace into militias, seizing all business. Eventually, even the hot dog carts were owned by scuffling members of the lower class, shutting down the free press and shifting all control into the hands of a bureaucracy answerable directly to the maximum leader. As for elections, those will be totally out of the question. Gradually, the moderate figurehead, President Urrutia, began to sense what was going on, and he, like many other Cubans, was not pleased. Urrutia resisted the power grab in the only ways he knew. He refused to attend cabinet meetings when Fidel was present. He made anti-communist speeches and television statements. He warned the Cuban people that something unsavory was being pulled on them. Many Cubans were alarmed, but Fidel stayed firmly on his course of secretly collectivizing society. Finally, in despair, Urrutia volunteered to go on a leave of absence from his official duties and not return. This, however, would not suit Fidel's purposes. It could be read too easily by people as precisely what it was, an act of protest. Castro had a better idea. He persuaded Urrutia to remain in office. Then he went on a campaign to smear Urrutia's name. First, Fidel appeared on television and implied that he himself was a staunch anti-communist, and then called Urrutia's public statements dishonorable. Then Fidel arranged to have Hundreds of thousands of Cuban peasants shipped to Havana for a celebration. As the peasants streamed into the Cuban capital, the bearded national savior went on television and delivered a 2-hour speech announcing his resignation as prime minister. What had forced this hero of the people to leave office? President Uribe said Uribe had concocted the phony specter of a communist menace and used this appalling lie to sabotage the revolution. Uribe explained Castro was an American patsy paid to spread the poison of Yankee propaganda. His duplicity, said Fidel, moved to the very brink of treason. Where have we heard things like that going on? Can we say fake news? The mood of the crowds gathered in the streets of Havana grew ugly. They chanted for Uribe's resignation. The earnest president, who had tried to warn his countrymen, signed his resignation while Fidel was still in mid-oration. Then Fidel piled the fantasy of an American-inspired conspiracy to even larger heights. The Great Lie. Remember Bernays, that wrote propaganda, talked about the big lie. The bigger the lie, the more it's believed. A former Cuban Air Force commander flew a light plane over Havana, dropping anti-Castro leaflets. Fidel's officials said the plane had machine gunned the city. One of Fidel's top revolutionary fighters resigned his post in disgust over the pro-communist direction things were taking. Fidel had arrested him and committed to a 20-year prison term. Fidel gathered a crowd of a million Cubans in Havana and announced that these new gestures had been part of a massive counter-revolutionary plot engineered by the fiendish Americans. The answer? The creation of massive militia, the restoration of the death penalty, and the reinstatement of the revolutionary tribunals to ferret out conspirators and send them to a string of concentration camps. Sounds like a lot like 1984. The ultimate result of these measures, of course, was to help Fidel banish the old ideal of democracy and to move the country firmly into the grip of one man capable of defending the supreme leader, it from the hulking enemy to the north. It's better when you have the United States does this all the time. It doesn't matter the size of the enemy. It could be North Korea. Look at North Korea right now and how much trouble Trump is in. He's doing exactly the same thing. Later, America played in Fidel's hands by plotting Castro's assassination and launching the pathetically bungled invasion of the Bay of Pigs. These U.S. maneuvers provided the maximum leader, and then I just say that, the maximum leader with the indispensable political tool. If people complained about food shortages the Castro government had brought, they were disturbed by the crippling of the sugar industry or noticed the virtual elimination through incompetence of the beef industry. Castro could blame the problems on America. As Fidel often confided, there was one extremely powerful, useful device for keeping the spirit of revolution alive. That tool, an external enemy. That is something straight out of Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda. The big lie. He used them all. The big lie, an external enemy. You could see that in Bernays' book. You could see that in The Prince by Machiavelli. Machiavelli talks about this all the time, and it was all wrapped up in Propaganda by Edward Bernays. These are very human themes that have been used over and over and over again since before recorded history. This is the way human beings work. So, and it's actually by ideas, ideas that are plausible and believable by the people. In other words, you have to find something visible and plausible to keep people down. That's how kings actually ruled, because the peasants actually stayed on the land and worked because they had to be protected by external enemies. That's the way feudalism or tribalism actually worked. The chief has to give you some kind of value, protect you against something, yourself or something on the outside. And if you don't have it within, you can't pay them off with wealth or anything practical. You have to give them something else, which is the persuasion. That's all this is persuasion. It's not power. It's just persuasion. And sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. But it is he's going to go further because Bloom is an expert in propaganda, because he was he was not what we call a press agent, but that's what he dealt in, public relations. He was a public relations master. So we're learning from the best. We're learning from the best. So take heed, ladies. Take heed, folks. Learn these lessons well, because he's drawing on something we already know, but he's also drawing on it as far as from nature all the way up to human beings, and talking about how you bind together a superorganism. But anyway, folks, that's the end of this particular lesson. I'm going to try to do another one maybe later on tonight or maybe tomorrow. Try to get caught up. Try to get this book finished, because I need to finish this for you guys. But anyway, I'll check you guys later. Tell me what you think in the comments section. Hope you get something out of it. For you folks that are sticking with me, I hope you get something out of it. Anyway, with that, I'm going to cut this lesson off right here. This is BGS out.